I found the crack in my basement wall the same morning Deborah Winters from the HOA board showed up at my door with a clipboard and a smile that could freeze lava. "Brandon Marsh, we need to discuss your mailbox," she said, tapping her pen against the papers. "It's exactly half an inch too far from the curb, according to Section 14.7 of our community guidelines." I'd lived in Pinecrest Estates in suburban Atlanta, Georgia for 3 years, and in that time, Deborah had cited me for everything from my grass being a quarter-inch too tall to my garbage, cans being visible from the street for 20 minutes past the acceptable window. The woman was in her late 40s with that particular haircut that seemed to come standard with HOA board membership, the kind that demanded to speak to managers across America. "Deborah, I've got water seeping through my basement wall. Can we handle the mailbox thing later?" Her expression didn't change. "The mailbox violation takes priority. You have 48 hours to correct it, or we'll begin the fine process. $25 per day." I closed the door on her mid-sentence and went back to my basement. The crack had appeared overnight, or at least I'd noticed it that morning when I went down to grab some tools. Water was definitely coming through, not a lot, but enough to pool on the concrete floor. I put down some towels and made a mental note to call a foundation specialist. What I didn't know then was that my little basement crack was connected to something much bigger, something that was about to turn Pinecrest Estates completely upside down. The next day, I was at work when my phone started blowing up. I'm a project manager for a construction firm, so I'm used to crisis calls, but these weren't from work. They were from my neighbors. First, it was Tim Rodriguez from 3 houses down, then Paula Chen from across the street, then at least 5 others. Everyone was reporting the same thing: water in their basements, cracks in their foundations, flooding in their crawl spaces. I left work early and drove back to the neighborhood. When I pulled onto our main street, I could see clusters of residents standing in driveways, talking animatedly. I parked and walked over to where Tim was standing with a few others. "Brandon, have you been down to the clubhouse?" Tim asked immediately. "No, why? You need to see it. The whole parking lot is flooding." The Pinecrest Estates clubhouse was the crown jewel of our HOA, or at least that's what they claimed in all their literature. It was a sprawling building with a gym, pool, meeting rooms, and a kitchen for community events. The HOA board had sunk over $2 million into renovating it just last year, and Deborah never missed an opportunity to remind us how lucky we were to have such amenities, even as our dues climbed to $800 a month. I drove down to the clubhouse with Tim following in his truck. The parking lot looked like a small lake had appeared overnight. Water was bubbling up through cracks in the asphalt, creating streams that flowed toward the storm drains, which were completely overwhelmed. The building itself sat slightly lower than the parking lot, and water was lapping at the foundation. "What the hell happened?" I asked. "No idea," Tim said, "but it started last night. Maria was here for her yoga class and said the floor in the gym started feeling spongy. By this morning, this." A few other residents had gathered, all looking concerned. I noticed Deborah's Mercedes parked near the entrance, so the HOA board obviously knew about the situation. I walked toward the building, my shoes squelching in the waterlogged ground. Inside the clubhouse, it was chaos. Deborah was there with the other board members: Greg Paulson, the treasurer, and Linda Hayes, the secretary. They were standing in the main hallway with a man I didn't recognize who was holding some kind of electronic device. "Excuse me," I said. "What's going on?" Deborah turned, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely rattled. "This is a board matter, Brandon. We'll send out an email to residents." "Half the neighborhood has water in their basements, Deborah. I think we're past private board matters." The man with the device spoke up. "I'm Jerry Chen, hydrologist. The HOA called me this morning to assess the situation." He had a weathered face and spoke with the confidence of someone who'd seen this kind of thing before. "What we're dealing with here is an underground spring, a significant one." "A spring? Under the clubhouse?" I asked. "Under the clubhouse, under the parking lot, and likely extending beneath a good portion of your neighborhood. Based on the flow rate I'm measuring, this is a substantial water source. It's been here for thousands of years, probably." Greg Paulson cleared his throat. "But our geological surveys before construction never showed any water issues." Jerry gave him a long look. "Did you actually do comprehensive hydrological studies, or did you just do the minimum required for permits?" The silence that followed answered that question pretty clearly. "Here's the situation," Jerry continued. "Something has changed recently to activate or redirect this spring. It could be construction nearby, changes in the water table, even all the rain we've had this spring. But now that it's flowing, it's undermining your foundation. This building is essentially sitting on top of a river now." "Can we pump it out?" Linda Hayes asked, her voice tight. "You can try, but you'll be pumping forever. Springs don't stop. This is groundwater finding its way to the surface. You'd need to completely redirect the water flow, which would mean major engineering work. And honestly, the damage to this building might already be done." Deborah's face had gone pale. "The renovation's just finished. We spent $2.3 million. "You should probably call a structural engineer and a building inspector," Jerry said. "This situation could be dangerous." I left the clubhouse and went back home, my mind racing. An underground spring, under our entire neighborhood. The implications were staggering, not just for the clubhouse but for all our homes. If the spring was undermining the clubhouse foundation, what was it doing to our houses? Over the next few days, things got worse fast. More residents reported basement flooding and foundation cracks. The water in the clubhouse parking lot kept rising despite the HOA's attempts to pump it out. They brought in industrial pumps that ran 24 hours a day, but the water level barely changed. Then the building inspector came. His name was Robert Kowalski, a city inspector for Gwinnett County, who had a reputation for being thorough and uncompromising. I happened to be at the clubhouse when he arrived, along with about 20 other residents who'd shown up demanding answers from the HOA board. Deborah met Robert at the entrance, her usual commanding presence somewhat diminished. She'd aged visibly in the past week, the stress clearly getting to her. "Inspector Kowalski, thank you for coming. As you can see, we have a minor water issue we're addressing." "Minor?" Robert looked around at the flooded parking lot and raised an eyebrow. He was a compact man in his 50s with gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. "Madam, I received a report about potential structural compromise due to groundwater infiltration. I'm here to assess whether this building is safe for occupancy." He spent the next 2 hours going through the clubhouse with a structural engineer named Sarah Jacobson who'd come with him. We all waited in the parking lot, watching through the windows as they examined walls, floors, and foundations. I could see them taking measurements, photos, and samples. When they finally emerged, Robert's face was grim. He pulled out a red tag from his bag, the kind that makes every contractor's heart sink. "Based on my inspection and the structural engineer's assessment, I'm condemning this building effective immediately," he announced. "The foundation has shifted significantly due to undermining from groundwater flow. There are cracks in load-bearing walls, the floor slab has heaved in multiple locations, and the southeast corner has dropped nearly 3 inches. This building is unsafe for occupancy." The crowd erupted in shock and angry questions. Deborah looked like she might faint. "You can't do that," she said, her voice shaking. "We just renovated, we have events scheduled, we have contracts." "I can and I am," Robert said firmly. He walked to the front door and affixed the red tag. "No one is to enter this building except for licensed contractors performing stabilization or demolition work. That's not a suggestion. That's a legal order. Anyone who enters without authorization can be prosecuted." "What about our investment?" Greg Paulson demanded. "The HOA has $2.3 million in this building. We have a mortgage on it, for crying out loud." Sarah Jacobson, the structural engineer, spoke up. "You should contact your insurance company immediately. This kind of damage, if it's due to a pre-existing geological feature, might not be covered under standard policies. You'll also need to address the source of the water. Until that spring is properly managed, nothing you build here will be stable." I raised my hand like I was in school. "What about our houses? If the spring runs under the neighborhood, are all our foundations at risk?" Robert turned to me. "That's a good question. I'd recommend every homeowner in this development get their foundation inspected by a licensed professional. If there's active groundwater movement, you could all be facing similar issues. The county's going to want a full hydrological survey of this entire area before anyone does any more construction." The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Residents were yelling at the board members, demanding to know what the HOA was going to do. Deborah tried to maintain control but eventually just retreated to her car with Greg and Linda following. I went home and immediately called a foundation inspector. He couldn't come for 3 days because he was suddenly swamped with calls from Pinecrest Estates. Apparently, I wasn't the only one taking Robert's advice seriously. That evening, I got a call from my friend Marcus, who's a civil engineer. I texted him about the situation, and he'd been doing some research. "Brandon, I looked up the development history of your neighborhood," Marcus said. "Pinecrest Estates was built in 2019 on what used to be farmland. Before that, it was undeveloped for decades." "Okay, so what's that mean?" "It means there's probably a reason it was undeveloped for so long. I pulled some old geological survey maps from the 1960s, before all that land got bought up by developers. Your area is marked as having high groundwater activity and potential spring sources. Basically, everyone knew there was water there, but your developer probably ignored it or didn't look deep enough into the history. Can they do that? Just build on land they know has water problems? If they do enough mitigation work, and the surveys they submit to the county don't show active problems, sure. Water tables change, springs can be dormant for years. But here's the thing. I also found records of a major housing development that was proposed for that same site back in 1987. It was canceled mid-planning. Why? Hydrological issues. They found evidence of underground springs and determined it would be too expensive to properly manage. The developer walked away from the project. I felt my stomach drop. So our developer either didn't know about that or didn't care. Probably the latter. Land was cheap, and they could make a killing on a luxury HOA community. I'd bet they did the bare minimum in surveys and hoped for the best. Or maybe the springs really were dormant when they built. Either way, they're active now, and you've got a serious problem. After I hung up with Marcus, I spent an hour going through the paperwork from when I'd bought my house. Sure enough, buried in the disclosures was a single line about potential minor groundwater presence and some boilerplate language about how the developer had taken appropriate measures to ensure structural integrity. It was the kind of legal cover-your-ass language that meant absolutely nothing now that my basement was flooding. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and it was standing room only. They'd rented space at a local community center since the clubhouse was condemned. Every seat was filled and people lined the walls. I counted at least 100 residents, maybe more. Deborah called the meeting to order, but before she could get through the opening remarks, people started shouting questions. What are you going to do about our foundations? Is the HOA going to pay for repairs? Did you know about the springs before you renovated the clubhouse? Deborah hammered a gavel on the table. Please, everyone, let us present our plan. We've consulted with attorneys and engineers and we have a path forward. The room quieted down, but the anger was palpable. I was sitting in the third row and I could feel the tension radiating from everyone around me. Greg Paulson, the treasurer, stood up with a spreadsheet. First, the financial situation. The clubhouse renovation was financed through a combination of reserve funds and a loan secured against future HOA dues. We have insurance on the building, but as the structural engineer mentioned, there's a question about coverage since this involves a pre-existing geological feature. What does that mean in English? Someone called out. It means the insurance company might not pay, Greg admitted. We're fighting it, but it could take months or years to resolve. The room erupted again. Deborah had to bang the gavel repeatedly to restore order. Linda Hayes took over. We've also received estimates for what it would take to manage the spring properly. We're looking at somewhere between $3 and $5 million for proper drainage systems, foundation remediation, and potentially having to completely demolish and rebuild the clubhouse on a different site. $5 million, I said out loud. Where's that money supposed to come from? We would need to pass a special assessment, Linda said reluctantly. Divided among all 240 homes in Pinecrest Estates, that would be approximately $20,000 per household. The room exploded. People were on their feet yelling. Someone threw a folded piece of paper at the board table. I sat there stunned. $20,000. I didn't have that kind of money just lying around. Most people in the neighborhood didn't. This is insane. A woman named Patricia shouted. You're telling us we have to pay for your mistake. You built on top of a spring. The original developer built on the spring, Deborah shot back, her composure cracking. The HOA inherited the situation. But you spent $2 million renovating a building that was doomed from the start. If you'd done proper surveys before the renovation, you would have found the problem before wasting all that money. I stood up, and maybe it was because I'm a project manager and I've run enough contentious meetings to know how to project my voice, but people quieted down when I spoke. Did the HOA do a hydrological survey before the clubhouse renovation? Yes or no? Deborah's jaw tightened. We did the surveys required by the permitting process. That's not what I asked. Did you do a comprehensive hydrological survey specifically looking for groundwater issues? The silence stretched out for several seconds. Finally, Greg answered, No. It would have added significant cost to the project, and we had no reason to believe there were issues. Except the building was showing signs of settling even before the renovation, wasn't it? This came from Tim Rodriguez, who'd apparently done some digging. I've lived here since the neighborhood opened in 2019. The clubhouse has always had drainage problems in the parking lot. There have always been wet spots in the basement. You ignored all the warning signs because you wanted your fancy renovation. That's not fair, Linda Hayes protested. We were trying to improve the community. You were trying to justify your existence and make yourselves feel important. Someone else yelled. The meeting devolved from there. The board eventually just stopped trying to maintain order and let people vent. It went on for nearly 3 hours, with resident after resident standing up to share their complaints, their fears about their home values, their anger at the situation. I left that meeting feeling exhausted and worried. $20,000 was not something I could easily manage, especially if my own foundation needed repairs on top of that. I started running numbers in my head, thinking about home equity lines of credit, personal loans, the savings I'd been building for the past 5 years that would be wiped out. The foundation inspector finally came to my house the following Monday. His name was Carlos, and he'd been inspecting foundations for 20 years. He spent 2 hours examining my basement, crawl space, and the exterior of my house. When he finished, he sat down with me at my kitchen table with his report. "You've got cracks, but honestly, it could be worse," Carlos said. "Your foundation has some settling damage, consistent with ground movement from water infiltration. You'll need to do some repair work, probably around $12,000 to $15,000 to stabilize what's there and add proper drainage." $12,000, I repeated numbly. On top of the $20,000 special assessment. Special assessment, I explained the HOA situation. Carlos whistled low. "Man, that's rough. But here's the thing. Even if you fix your foundation now, if they don't address the spring properly, you're just going to have the same problems again in a few years. You need that water managed at the source, redirected away from the neighborhood entirely. Otherwise, you're all just putting Band-Aids on a gunshot wound." After Carlos left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the estimate. $30,000+. My house, which I'd bought for $350,000 3 years ago, was probably worth less than that now. Who would buy a house in a neighborhood with active groundwater issues and a condemned clubhouse? I started making calls. I called a real estate attorney to understand my options. I called my mortgage company to see if there were any protections for situations like this. I called the original developer, Pemberton Properties, though I wasn't surprised when they declined to comment on the situation beyond saying they'd complied with all regulations during construction. What I learned was not encouraging. The HOA had the legal right to pass special assessments for emergency situations, and this qualified. If homeowners refused to pay, the HOA could place liens on their properties. As for the developer, the statute of limitations for construction defect claims in Georgia was 8 years for latent defects, but proving they knew about the springs and built anyway would be nearly impossible without documented evidence. I wasn't the only one doing research. A group of residents, led by Tim Rodriguez and a retired lawyer named Walter Chen, started organizing. They created an email group and Facebook page for Pinecrest Estates residents. Within days, hundreds of people had joined. The group's first major action was hiring their own attorney, a real estate litigation specialist named Amanda Flores. She agreed to review the HOA's authority to pass the special assessment and investigate whether there were grounds for legal action against either the HOA board or the original developer. I attended the first meeting Amanda held with residents, which took place in the gymnasium of a local high school because we needed the space. Over 300 people showed up. Amanda was a sharp woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She commanded attention immediately. "I've reviewed the HOA bylaws and the master declaration for Pinecrest Estates," she began. "The board does have the authority to pass special assessments for emergency repairs and improvements. However, there are limitations. They must provide proper notice, hold a vote, and the assessment must be reasonably calculated to address the actual problem." "What about suing the developer?" someone asked. "I've researched Pemberton Properties. They're still in business, which is good. However, proving they had knowledge of the springs and deliberately concealed that information will be challenging." We'd need to subpoena their internal documents, engineering reports, anything that shows they knew or should have known about the hydrological issues. What about the HOA board itself? Patricia asked. They spent $2 million on a renovation without doing proper surveys. Isn't that negligence? Potentially, yes. Board members have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the community. If they were grossly negligent in how they handled the clubhouse renovation, individual board members could be held personally liable. However, most HOA boards have directors' and officers' insurance that would cover such claims. Walter Chen, the retired lawyer, raised his hand. Amanda, what's our best strategy here? Multiple fronts, Amanda said. First, we challenge the special assessment on the grounds that it's excessive and wasn't properly calculated. We demand a full accounting of how they arrived at that $5 million figure. Second, we investigate the board's decision-making process regarding the renovation. We request all emails, meeting minutes, and communications related to the clubhouse project. Third, we pursue the developer. Even if we can't prove they knowingly built on bad land, we might be able to settle for something. What's this going to cost? I asked. I'll work on contingency for any claims against the developer or the board, meaning I get paid a percentage if we win. For the assessment challenge, I'd need a modest retainer that could be split among all participating homeowners. We're talking maybe $500 per household for around 300 households. People agreed to the plan. Within a week, over 250 families had signed up and paid their portion of the retainer. We were going to fight this. The HOA board did not take kindly to being challenged. Deborah sent out a tersely worded email reminding everyone that the special assessment was necessary and legal, and that residents should focus on supporting the community rather than attacking its leadership. That email was a mistake. It galvanized opposition against the board. People who'd been on the fence joined our group. Even some who'd initially been friendly with Deborah turned against her. Amanda Flores filed a formal request for documents from the HOA, citing Georgia law that required HOAs to maintain and provide access to certain records. The board stalled for 2 weeks before finally producing a stack of papers that Amanda immediately identified as incomplete. They're hiding something, she told our organizing committee, which now included me, Tim, Walter, and a few others. The meeting minutes from last year are heavily redacted, and there are references to emails and reports that weren't included. Can we force them to hand everything over? Tim asked. Yes, but it'll require a court order. I'm preparing a motion to compel discovery. But in the meantime, I want to talk to people who might know what happened. Were any of you involved in the renovation planning? None of us had been. The board had kept the clubhouse project tightly controlled, making all decisions in executive session without member input. What about contractors? I suggested. The construction company that did the work would have documentation, plans, permits, communications with the board. Amanda's eyes lit up. That's good thinking. What was the contractor's name? I pulled out my phone and found an old HOA newsletter that had featured the renovation. Prestige Building Solutions. They're based in Marietta. I'll reach out to them, Amanda said. They might be willing to cooperate, especially if they start to worry about their own liability. While Amanda pursued the legal angle, the neighborhood situation continued to deteriorate. The spring showed no signs of slowing down. The condemned clubhouse sat empty, water still pooling around its foundation. More homeowners reported foundation issues. Property values were in freefall as word spread about Pinecrest Estates problems. Then things got worse in a way none of us expected. It was early on a Tuesday morning when I got a frantic call from Tim. Brandon, Turn on the local news. Now. I grabbed my remote and switched to Channel 11, the Atlanta NBC affiliate. A reporter was standing in front of our neighborhood's entrance sign. What residents are calling a crisis situation in this suburban Gwinnett County neighborhood, the reporter was saying. Pinecrest Estates, a development of nearly 250 homes, is dealing with the discovery of a massive underground spring that has condemned the community clubhouse and damaged dozens of homes. But now, residents are accusing the HOA board of a potential cover-up. My phone started ringing off the hook. Other residents were seeing the news. I texted Tim. Who called the media? No idea, but it's about to get real. The news coverage was extensive and not favorable to the HOA. Reporters interviewed residents, showed footage of flooded basements and the condemned clubhouse, and highlighted the $20,000 special assessment. They even got a statement from Deborah, who looked absolutely furious on camera and refused to answer most questions. Within 24 hours, the story had been picked up by regional and even some national outlets. HOA nightmare. Georgia community faces financial ruin over hidden springs, read one headline. Another said, luxury development built on underground river homeowners demand answers. The media attention brought unexpected help. A geology professor from Georgia Tech reached out, offering to do a pro bono survey of the neighborhood to understand the full extent of the spring system. An advocacy group for HOA reform contacted Amanda, offering support and resources. Most importantly, the state attorney general's office took notice. The AG's Consumer Protection Division sent an investigator to look into the situation. His name was David Park, and he was particularly interested in what the original developer had known about the groundwater situation. I met with David at a coffee shop near my office. He was a methodical man in his early 30s who took copious notes as I walked him through everything. The challenge with developer liability is always knowledge and intent, David explained. Did they know about the springs, or were they negligent in not finding out? There's a legal difference. Does it matter? I asked. Either way, people built houses and spent their life savings on homes that are falling apart. It matters for what kind of case we can bring. If they knowingly concealed material defects, that's fraud. We can pursue criminal charges. If they were just negligent, it's civil liability, and that's harder for my office to touch. What would prove they knew? Internal communications, surveys they commissioned and then buried, testimony from their engineers or contractors. Anything showing they had the information and chose not to disclose it. I thought about that. The contractor who did the clubhouse renovation might know something. If the board or the developer mentioned concerns about water, the contractor would have records. David nodded. Your attorney is already pursuing that angle. I'm working on getting the developer's records through a subpoena. If there's evidence of fraud, we'll find it. The Georgia Tech geology team arrived 2 weeks later. Professor Elizabeth Ramirez and 3 graduate students spent 5 days doing ground-penetrating radar surveys, water table measurements, and analyzing the flow patterns of the spring. Their findings were sobering. Professor Ramirez presented the results at a community meeting. She projected a map of Pinecrest Estates on a screen, with red and orange areas showing the path of the underground spring system. What we've discovered is a substantial aquifer system with multiple spring outlets, she explained. The primary spring is directly beneath the clubhouse, which explains why the damage there is most severe. But there are at least 3 secondary spring channels running beneath the neighborhood, affecting roughly 60% of the homes. A murmur ran through the crowd. 60%. That was over 150 homes. The good news, if you can call it that, is that the springs are relatively shallow, between 15 and 30 feet below the surface. That makes them manageable from an engineering standpoint. The bad news is that management will be expensive and complex. How expensive? Someone asked. For a proper solution, drainage systems, French drains, possible relocation of the most affected structures, you're looking at somewhere between $8 and $12 million for the entire community. The number hit like a bomb. 12 million. Divided among 240 homes, that was $50,000 per household. People started shouting again. This was beyond what anyone could manage. You couldn't just come up with $50,000. Many people in the neighborhood had already stretched themselves financially to buy their homes. I raised my hand, and Professor Ramirez nodded at me. Is there any scenario where we don't have to do all that work? Could we just live with the springs? She shook her head. Not safely. The water is actively undermining foundations. Without management, you'll see progressive failure of structures throughout the neighborhood. Some homes might last 5 years, others might have catastrophic foundation failure in months. It's not a matter of if, but when. After the meeting ended, I walked out to the parking lot feeling completely defeated. I'd worked so hard to buy this house, to build stability in my life. Now it was all collapsing, literally and figuratively. Tim caught up with me. We need to hold the board accountable for this. They had to have known something was wrong. Even if they did, we're still stuck with the problem, I said bitterly. Suing them doesn't make the springs go away. No, but it might get us actual financial relief. If they were negligent, their insurance might have to pay out. That could reduce what we all owe. He had a point. I was so focused on the immediate crisis that I'd lost sight of the accountability piece. Amanda Flores's investigation was starting to bear fruit. The contractor, Prestige Building Solutions, had been too cooperative, actually, which suggested they were worried about their own liability. They'd provided emails, plans, and documentation of conversations with the HOA board during the renovation planning. What emerged was damning. Amanda presented her findings to our organizing committee first, before taking them public. We met in Walter Chen's living room, me, Tim, Walter, Patricia, and a few others. The board knew, Amanda said without preamble. Or at least, they had strong reasons to suspect there were serious problems and chose to ignore them. She pulled out a stack of emails. These are from 18 months ago, during the renovation planning phase. The contractor raised concerns about water staining in the clubhouse basement and suggested bringing in a hydrologist to assess potential groundwater issues. Deborah Winters personally responded, and I quote, "We don't have budget for additional consultants. The building has stood for 5 years. It'll be fine." That's negligence, Walter said immediately. It gets worse. 3 months before the renovation started, a plumber working on the clubhouse filed a report about unusual water pressure and dampness in the foundation. He recommended further investigation. That report went to Greg Paulson, who apparently never acted on it. Did the full board know? I asked. Based on meeting minutes, yes. There was a discussion in executive session about foundation concerns and water management challenges, but they voted to proceed with the renovation anyway. The vote was 3-1, with Linda Hayes dissenting. That was interesting. Linda had voted against it. So what does this mean legally? Patricia asked. It means we have a strong case for gross negligence against the board. They had information suggesting serious structural problems and chose to ignore it, then spent $2 million on renovations that were doomed to fail. That's a clear breach of fiduciary duty. Can we sue them personally? Tim asked. We can try. They have directors' and officers' insurance, but policies typically don't cover gross negligence or intentional wrongdoing. If we can prove they knowingly put the community at risk, their personal assets could be on the line. I felt a grim satisfaction at that thought. Deborah had spent 3 years making my life miserable over mailboxes and grass height. Now she might actually face consequences for real misconduct. Amanda filed suit against the board members the following week. The complaint alleged breach of fiduciary duty, gross negligence, and financial mismanagement. It sought damages to cover the cost of properly managing the springs and repairing the clubhouse, or, alternatively, removing it entirely. The lawsuit made news immediately. The local media, which had been following the Pinecrest Estates story closely, jumped on it. Deborah, Greg, and Linda were named individually, along with the HOA as an entity. I happened to run into Deborah at the grocery store 2 days after the suit was filed. She was in the produce section, and when she saw me, her face went hard. "I hope you're proud of yourself," she said coldly, "destroying people's reputations over a natural disaster." "A natural disaster you made worse by ignoring warnings and wasting $2 million, I replied. I wasn't usually confrontational, but I'd had enough. "You could have done the right thing. You could have investigated properly. Instead, you bulldozed ahead because you wanted your fancy clubhouse." "We were trying to improve the community," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. "You were trying to leave a legacy. You wanted to be remembered as the board president who transformed Pinecrest Estates. Well, congratulations. You'll be remembered, just not the way you wanted." She left her cart and walked out of the store. The legal case moved forward with surprising speed. The HOA's insurance company, after reviewing the evidence Amanda had compiled, made a settlement offer within 6 weeks. They'd pay $3 million to the community, which would be used for spring management and foundation repairs. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it was significant. Combined with funds the HOA still had in reserves, it brought the needed special assessment down from $50,000 per household to around $15,000. Still a huge amount, but at least manageable for most people. The settlement also required Deborah, Greg, and Linda to resign from the board immediately. While the civil case was settling, David Park from the Attorney General's office was making progress on the developer investigation. He'd subpoenaed records from Pemberton Properties and found exactly what we'd hoped for: evidence that they'd known about the groundwater issues. Buried in the developer's files were hydrological reports from 2018, before construction began. The reports clearly identified underground springs and recommended extensive drainage infrastructure and modified foundation designs for all structures. The estimated cost to properly address the water issues would have been around $3 million for the entire development. Pemberton Properties had chosen not to spend that money. Instead, they'd done minimal drainage work, used standard foundation designs, and hoped for the best. They disclosed the potential minor groundwater presence in their legally required paperwork, but had significantly downplayed the risks. David Park presented his findings to us at another community meeting. What Pemberton Properties did was knowingly conceal material defects from buyers. That's fraud under Georgia law. My office is filing criminal charges against the company and its principals. The room erupted in applause. Finally, someone was being held accountable. Additionally, David continued, we're pursuing a civil enforcement action to recover damages on behalf of all affected homeowners. If successful, the developer would be required to pay for proper remediation of the spring system throughout the neighborhood. "How long will that take?" someone asked. "Realistically, 2 to 3 years. These cases move slowly, but we have strong evidence and I'm optimistic about our chances. The criminal charges against Pemberton Properties made national news. It was rare for developers to face criminal prosecution for construction defects, and the case became a flashpoint in the larger debate about HOA governance and developer accountability. The company's president, a man named Richard Pemberton, was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud and theft by deception. 2 other executives were also charged. They all posted bail and maintained their innocence, but the evidence was damning. Meanwhile, life in Pinecrest Estates continued in a strange limbo. The clubhouse remained condemned and eventually had to be demolished entirely when the foundation shifted so much that the building became a safety hazard. The demolition took 3 weeks and cost another $100,000. The new HOA board, elected in an emergency vote after the old board resigned, was more responsive and transparent. They hired a major engineering firm to design a comprehensive water management system for the neighborhood. The plan involved installing an extensive network of drainage pipes and channels that would capture the spring water and redirect it to a retention pond on the edge of the community. From there, it would flow into the county's storm water system. Individual homes would need foundation repairs and their own drainage improvements, but the community-wide system would prevent future damage. The total cost ended up being $9 million. With the insurance settlement, the developer case proceeds when they eventually came through, and the special assessment, it was theoretically manageable, but it would take years to fully implement. I paid my $15,000 assessment by taking out a home equity line of credit. It hurt, but I could handle it. Some of my neighbors weren't so fortunate. About 30 families ended up having to sell and move, taking losses on their homes. It was heartbreaking to watch moving trucks pull up, knowing these people were being forced out by circumstances beyond their control. The property values in Pinecrest Estates were in shambles. Houses that had sold for $350,000 in 2022 were now going for $200,000 or less, and that was if you could find a buyer at all. Banks were reluctant to write mortgages for properties with known foundation issues, even if repairs were planned. The legal cases dragged on. The criminal trial of Richard Pemberton and his executives was delayed multiple times. The civil case moved at the pace of continental drift. But slowly, painfully, progress was made. About a year and a half after the spring was first discovered, the water management system was finally completed. The retention pond was finished, the drainage network was installed, and pumps were running 24/7 to keep the water flowing away from homes. Professor Ramirez from Georgia Tech came back to assess the work. Her report was cautiously optimistic. The system is performing as designed. Water levels beneath the neighborhood have dropped significantly. As long as the infrastructure is maintained properly, you should see stabilization of foundation issues. It wasn't a perfect solution. Some homes had sustained too much damage and needed extensive foundation work that cost tens of thousands more on top of the special assessment. But at least the active threat was contained. The criminal trial finally took place 2 years after the spring's discovery. I attended several days of testimony, watching as engineers, geologists, and former Pemberton Properties employees testified about what the company had known and when. The evidence was overwhelming. Richard Pemberton and his team had received clear warnings about the springs, had been given specific recommendations for mitigation, and had deliberately chosen to ignore them to save money and maximize profits. The jury found all 3 defendants guilty on multiple counts of fraud. Richard Pemberton was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution. His 2 executives received 3 years each, but the real victory came from the civil judgment. The court ordered Pemberton Properties to pay $42 million in damages to Pinecrest Estates homeowners. Even after the company declared bankruptcy and the actual recovery was negotiated down, each homeowner eventually received about $70,000 in compensation. That money, combined with insurance payouts and the improvements that had been made, finally stabilized the situation. People could afford to do their foundation repairs. Property values started to slowly recover as word spread that the problem had been addressed. Deborah Winters moved out of Pinecrest Estates about 6 months after the scandal broke. I heard she and her husband relocated somewhere in North Carolina. I never saw her again. Linda Hayes, the board member who'd voted against the renovation, became something of a hero in the neighborhood. She'd been vindicated by subsequent events, and people respected that she'd tried to stop the disaster. She ran for the new board and won easily, serving for several years. As for me, I stayed in my house. After everything was repaired and compensated, I'd actually come out relatively even financially. More importantly, I'd learned a lot about HOA governance, community organizing, and standing up for what was right. The Pinecrest Estates disaster became a case study in HOA mismanagement and developer fraud. Amanda Flores wrote a book about the case that became required reading in some law schools. Professor Ramirez published several papers about the geology of the spring system. The Georgia legislature even passed new laws requiring more extensive geological surveys before residential developments could be approved. 3 years after that first crack appeared in my basement, I was sitting on my back deck on a warm Saturday afternoon. The retention pond was visible in the distance, surrounded by walking trails the new HOA board had installed. Kids were playing in the neighborhood park. Houses that had been empty were occupied again by new families willing to take a chance on Pinecrest Estates now that the problems had been fixed. Tim Rodriguez came over with a 6-pack of beer. We sat on the deck and watched the sun set over the neighborhood we'd fought so hard to save. "You know what's crazy?" Tim said. "If that spring had never been discovered, the clubhouse would have eventually collapsed anyway. Maybe during an event with hundreds of people inside." I'd thought about that too. As terrible as everything had been, it could have been worse, much worse. "We survived," I said simply. "The neighborhood survived, and we made sure the people responsible actually faced consequences." That's more than most HOA horror stories can say. Tim raised his beer. "To surviving HOA disasters." I clinked my bottle against his. "To surviving, and to never, ever trusting an HOA board that doesn't do their homework." We drank to that, sitting in the fading light, in the neighborhood that had tested us in ways we'd never expected, but had ultimately brought the community together in a way that luxury amenities and clubhouse renovations never could have. The underground spring still flowed beneath us, ancient and unstoppable, but now it was managed, controlled, directed safely away. Like everything else in life, it turned out that you couldn't fight nature, you could only work with it, adapt to it, and make the best of what you'd been given. And in the end, that was enough.